This is a bedtime story, not the kind meant to comfort you, the kind meant to slow things down. So wherever you are, settle in. Let the day loosen its grip a little. You don't need to follow arguments. You don't need to remember names. Just stay with the feeling. For a long time, people believed the world could be trusted. They believed that if they thought carefully enough, things would make sense. That if they reasoned honestly, truth would hold. That if they chose freely, they were acting as themselves. Science advanced, systems stabilized, knowledge accumulated. The world became more explainable, more predictable, more manageable. Thinking itself began to feel like the solution. Reason became something people leaned on without noticing, until it started to wobble. Not all at once, not dramatically. Pressure to say why certainty felt so important in the first place. The harder thinking tried to secure itself, the less stable it became. The more reason promised clarity, the more it produced disagreement. Not about the world, but about whether the mind could be trusted to reach it at all. This unease wasn't academic. If thinking failed, everything built on it weakened. Science, morality, freedom, even the quiet assumption that the world could still be relied upon. Immanuel Kant lived inside this tension. He did not arrive trying to enlighten anyone. He did not come to expand human possibility. He arrived at a moment when confidence itself had become risky, when certainty threatened to undo the very things it was meant to protect. What disturbed Kant was not ignorance, it was overreach. Too many claims about what could be known, too much confidence in what the mind believed it was touching, too little awareness of what thinking might be doing to itself. The danger wasn't that people knew too little, it was that they felt too sure. Kant began to suspect that if this continued, knowledge would collapse not from weakness, but from excess. That reason, left unchecked, would dissolve into contradiction and speculation until nothing felt reliable anymore. So instead of asking how far the mind could go, he asked something colder: where must it stop? That unless thinking agreed to boundaries, science would lose credibility, morality would lose authority, and freedom would lose meaning. Something had to be restrained, or nothing would hold. Access would be narrowed. The comforting idea that reality simply reveals itself to us would have to be set aside, not all at once, but permanently. A way for knowledge to survive by touching less. A way for morality to exist without relying on feeling. A way for freedom to function, even when it stopped feeling expansive. What he offered worked, but it worked by removing something many people didn't realize they depended on. The belief that thinking harder brings us closer to reality. The belief that freedom should feel open. The belief that doing the right thing should feel good. Kant doesn't argue against these beliefs. He builds a world where they no longer function the way they once did. And he does it quietly enough that by the time the shift is felt, there is no obvious way back. This is not the story of a man who gave answers. It is the story of a man who decided that without limits, even reason becomes a liability, and what had to be given up to make thinking safe again has never fully been returned. Before we continue, take a quiet moment. If you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, feel free to let us know in the comments where you are and what time it is for you as this story reaches you. Some people listen late at night. Others while working, traveling, or trying to slow their thoughts. There's no right moment for a story like this, only the one you happen to be in. And if this kind of long-form history helps you stay with the night, consider subscribing so you can find your way back again. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The problem did not announce itself. There were no alarms, no sudden collapse of belief, no shared moment where everyone agreed something had gone wrong. Life continued to function. People argued, but they always had. Ideas competed, but that was expected. Knowledge still produced results. Science still worked. Moral language still circulated. On the surface, nothing was broken, and that was precisely the problem. The unease Kant sensed did not come from failure. It came from success that had begun to stretch itself too far. Thinking was doing more than it had ever done before, explaining more, reaching further, claiming confidence in places it had once approached carefully. Certainty had become ambitious. It no longer wanted to describe the world, it wanted to secure it. People did not just use reason to navigate experience. They used it to justify existence itself. Truth was no longer something provisional. It was something people expected to possess, and possession changes that character of belief. When certainty becomes something you hold, losing it starts to feel dangerous. Doubt no longer feels curious. It feels destabilizing. Questions are tolerated only if they promise resolution. Uncertainty is framed as weakness rather than information. This shift happened quietly. No one decided it. No one voted for it. It emerged from accumulation, from success layered on success, from confidence rewarded often enough that it stopped checking its own reach. The mind began to trust itself too much. This was not arrogance in the ordinary sense. It was familiarity. Reason had worked reliably for long enough that people stopped noticing its conditions. They assumed the world was available to them simply because it had been so cooperative so far. But cooperation is not the same as access. The more thinkers tried to ground certainty, the more contradictions appeared. Not because the world became stranger, but because claims became larger. Questions that once remained open were now treated as solvable. Boundaries that had once been implicit were crossed without hesitation. This created tension that did not feel philosophical. It felt structural. If knowledge could claim everything, then disagreement became threatening. If reason could reach anywhere, then competing claims were no longer differences of perspective. They were errors that needed correction. Certainty demanded defense, and defense demands force, even when it is intellectual. Kant watched this happening from the inside. He saw reason being asked to do work. It was never designed to sustain. He saw confidence replacing caution. He saw certainty expanding without accounting for what it might destabilize along the way. The danger was not that people were wrong. It was that they no longer knew how to be uncertain without panic. This mattered because uncertainty is not a flaw in thinking. It is a condition of it. Without limits, reason does not become stronger. It becomes brittle. It breaks when stretched beyond what it can hold. But brittleness is hard to notice in advance. Things still appear solid. Structures remain standing. Only later does the fracture become visible. Often after pressure has already been applied too forcefully to reverse. Kant's insight was not dramatic. It was preventative. He suspected that if thinking continued in this direction, knowledge would eventually lose credibility. Morality would collapse into argument. Freedom would dissolve into competing justifications, not because reason failed, but because it claimed too much. And once everything is claimed, nothing feels stable. The unsettling part was that no one seemed alarmed. The world was not asking for restraint. It was asking for more explanation, more justification, more certainty. Kant realized that waiting for visible failure would be too late. The problem had to be addressed before it became obvious, not by expanding reason further, but by narrowing it, not by celebrating certainty, but by containing it. To suggest that the mind should stop reaching felt unnecessary, even regressive. But Kant saw something most people did not. That once confidence becomes habitual, it stops protecting what it claims to serve. The problem nobody noticed was not ignorance. It was the quiet transformation of certainty into expectation. And expectations, once disappointed, do not fail gently. They take everything they were supporting with them. Kant's work begins here, not with answers, but with the suspicion that thinking itself had drifted into danger, and that unless something intervened, the very tools meant to secure meaning would be the first things to lose it. For most of human history, thinking was a refuge. When the world felt uncertain, the mind offered steadiness. When events overwhelmed, reason promised distance. To think was to step back, to gain clarity, to regain control. That expectation lingered longer than anyone realized. But by Kant's time, thinking no longer felt like retreat. It felt like exposure. The more people relied on reason to secure truth, the more fragile that truth began to seem. Arguments multiplied, systems competed. Each claim arrived with confidence, and each confidence was met by another that refused to yield. This was not confusion caused by ignorance, it was confusion produced by precision. Every improvement in explanation created new disagreement. Every attempt to ground certainty produced more elaborate doubt. The mind did not fail outright. It became crowded, dense with competing claims, each insisting on its own legitimacy. Thinking was no longer calming. It was destabilizing. This shift did not announce itself as fear. It felt like responsibility. If reason could explain the world, then it had to. If truth was accessible, then failing to secure it felt negligent. Uncertainty stopped being a neutral condition and started to feel like a personal shortcoming. People did not ask whether everything should be known, they asked why it wasn't yet. This expectation changed how doubt was experienced. Questions no longer opened space. They applied pressure. They demanded resolution. To hesitate was to fall behind. To withhold judgment was to appear weak. Thinking sped up, and speed changes how thought behaves. When reflection accelerates, nuance thins, positions harden more quickly, the need to be correct overtakes the willingness to be careful, reason becomes defensive, guarding conclusions rather than testing them. Kant noticed something unsettling here. Reason was being used as if it were immune to error simply because it was systematic. The structure of thinking began to stand in for reliability. If an argument was coherent enough, it was treated as trustworthy, even when its reach exceeded what experience could confirm. This is where thinking stopped feeling safe, not because it lacked rigor, but because it lacked restraint. Ideas were no longer provisional, they were asserted. Claims were no longer tentative, they were defended. Disagreement felt less like conversation and more like threat, because so much depended on being right. If reason could not secure truth, what could? This question lingered beneath intellectual life like static. It touched science, morality, and belief without resolving any of them. Each domain leaned harder on thinking to justify itself. Even as thinking produced more instability, the harder it leaned. The danger was subtle. If reason could justify anything, then it justified nothing reliably. If the mind could reach everywhere, then it lacked a clear sense of where it should stop. And without stopping points, certainty becomes fragile, because it has nothing firm to rest on. Kant sensed that something essential was being misunderstood. Thinking was being treated as if it guaranteed access. But access is not automatic. The mind does not simply receive the world. It organizes it, shapes it, filters it. And when those processes are ignored, thinking mistakes its own structure for reality itself. This confusion carries a cost. When certainty fails after being promised, disappointment hardens into distrust. Skepticism grows not as curiosity, but as defense. People stop believing not because they doubt everything, but because they can no longer tell what deserves belief. This is how thinking becomes dangerous, not because it asks too many questions, but because it promises answers it cannot secure. It invites confidence without clarifying its limits. It encourages certainty without accounting for the conditions that make certainty possible. Kant did not see this as a crisis of intelligence. He saw it as a crisis of expectation. Reason had been asked to do too much, to ground truth, justify morality, secure freedom, and explain reality itself. And the more it was asked, the more brittle it became. By this point, thinking no longer offered rest. It offered obligation. To think was to take a position. To reason was to defend it. To doubt was to risk everything built on it. This was not sustainable. But abandoning reason was not an option. The only remaining possibility was restraint, not as surrender. Kant's project begins at the moment thinking loses its innocence, when reason stops feeling like a safe place to stand and starts feeling like something that might give way beneath you if it is not carefully contained. Kant's response was not expansion. It was refusal. He did not try to make reason stronger, faster, or more ambitious. He did not offer a new method that promised better access to truth. Instead, he introduced a restriction so fundamental that it changed what thinking was allowed to claim at all. This was the first cut. Kant began by questioning something most people had never questioned, the assumption that the mind simply opens onto reality, that when we think, we are reaching outward, touching the world as it is, and bringing it back intact. He suspected this was wrong, not slightly wrong, structurally wrong. The mind, he argued, does not encounter the world directly. It organizes experience before we ever become aware of it, shaping and ordering what appears so thoroughly that we never access anything untouched by that process. This was not meant to be poetic, it was meant to be limiting. If the mind is always shaping what it encounters, then certainty becomes conditional. Knowledge can no longer claim to reveal reality as it exists independently of us. It can only describe reality as it appears once the mind has already done its work. This distinction mattered more than it first appeared, because it meant that reason had been overestimating itself, treating its own structure as evidence of access. confusing coherence with truth, mistaking internal consistency for contact with what lies beyond experience. Kant did not deny knowledge. He redefined its reach. What could be known was no longer unlimited. It was bounded by the conditions of human cognition itself. Thinking could operate reliably, but only within a carefully drawn perimeter. Outside that boundary, claims were no longer knowledge. They were speculation, however elegant they sounded. This was the restriction, and it was severe. Questions about ultimate reality, about what exists beyond experience, were not answered. They were set aside, not postponed, not softened. It meant giving up the hope that reason could settle everything, that thinking, if pushed hard enough, would eventually reach the foundations of existence. Kant insisted that this hope was not just unrealistic, but dangerous, because it encouraged certainty where none was earned. By cutting reason back to what it could legitimately claim, Kant believed he was protecting it from collapse, preventing it from turning against itself under the weight of its own ambition, saving knowledge by refusing to let it pretend to be more than it was. But protection came with cost. The world became thinner. Reality was no longer something the mind could claim in full. There was always a remainder, something present but unreachable. This did not make life chaotic. It made it constrained. Certainty could exist again, but only within limits that could not be crossed without distortion. Freedom could continue, but only inside rules the mind did not choose. Thinking could be trusted, but only when it stopped short of its own curiosity. Kant knew this would feel unsatisfying. Restriction rarely feels like progress. Boundaries are experienced as loss before they are experienced as safety. Without limits, reason would keep expanding until it dissolved its own authority. Knowledge would fracture into competing systems, each coherent, none decisive. Skepticism would harden, meaning would thin. The first restriction was meant to prevent that future. It was not a solution that made people feel better. It was a solution designed to hold. And from this moment on, everything Kant would build rested on this decision, that the mind's strength lay not in how far it could reach, but in how carefully it could learn to stop reaching for what it could never hold. The restriction did not end with the mind. It moved outward. Once Kant accepted that knowledge was shaped by the conditions of thinking itself, a deeper problem appeared. Science still worked. Its predictions held. Its methods produced results. But its authority now rested on something fragile. If knowledge never reaches reality as it is, then what exactly is science doing when it succeeds? This question mattered more than it sounded. Science had become the most reliable structure modern life possessed. It organized the world, stabilized expectations, justified decisions. Its success was not abstract. It was practical, visible, trusted, and that trust depended on a quiet assumption. That science described reality itself. Kant realized this assumption could not survive his restriction. If the mind always shapes what it encounters, then science does not reveal the world in itself. It reveals the world as it appears once human cognition has already organized it. Its laws describe patterns within experience, not assurances about what lies beyond it. This was not an attack on science. It was a rescue. Kant believed that if science continued claiming more than it could justify, it would eventually lose credibility. Competing systems would multiply. Certainty would fracture. Skepticism would return, not as curiosity, but as erosion. So he narrowed science's claim, not its usefulness, not its reliability, its reach. Science, Kant argued, works precisely because it does not touch ultimate reality. It succeeds by staying within the domain shaped by human perception and understanding. Its strength lies not in metaphysical access, but in disciplined restraint. This was the trade. Science would be allowed authority, but not sovereignty. It could explain how phenomena behave, how events unfold, how regularities emerge, but it could not claim to explain why reality exists as it does, or what lies beneath appearance itself. Those questions were not answered. They were disallowed. This move preserved science at a cost. It remained effective, but less complete, powerful, but not total, reliable, but limited to a carefully defined field. What science gained in precision, it surrendered in depth. Science no longer carried the promise of ultimate truth. It became procedural, methodical, structured around rules rather than revelation. Its success no longer implied meaning, only consistency. Knowledge could still accumulate, progress could still be measured, but the sense that science disclosed the world's inner nature quietly receded. Explanation replaced understanding, prediction replaced intimacy. The world became more stable. It also became more distant. By separating scientific knowledge from ultimate reality, Kant created space for order without certainty. Systems could function without claiming completeness. Structures could hold without pretending to explain everything they supported. But something was left unresolved. If science could no longer answer the deepest questions, where did those questions go? They did not disappear. They were suspended, set aside in the name of stability, treated as unanswerable rather than unimportant. The price of protecting knowledge was the quiet removal of meaning from its center. Kant did not see this as loss. He saw it as necessity. A world where science accepted its limits could continue. This is how science was saved, by being weakened, not in its results but in its claims, not in its effectiveness but in its ambition. It was allowed to function precisely because it stopped reaching for what it could not hold. The success of this move is hard to deny. Modern life rests on it. But so does a subtle absence, the sense that knowledge once promised more than reliability. That explanation once implied understanding. That knowing how something works once felt closer to knowing what it was. Kant ensured that science would endure. He also ensured that it would do so without answering the questions people quietly continued to ask. And those unanswered questions did not fade. They waited. The restriction did not stop with knowledge. Once reason accepted limits, freedom had to be reconsidered as well. For a long time, freedom had been understood as openness, the ability to choose, to decide according to preference, to move toward what felt right and away from what did not. Freedom was experienced as expansion, as space widening around the individual. Kant did not deny this experience. He distrusted it, because feeling free is not the same as being free, and feelings, he believed, did not stay where they began. They shifted with circumstance, bent under pressure, changed shape, depending on what was at stake. A freedom built on inclination never remained stable, not because it was false, but because it moved. Anything that responded to advantage or comfort could not hold consistently enough to support responsibility. So he narrowed it. Freedom was no longer the ability to choose what one wanted. It became something quieter, a commitment to act according to a rule that did not adjust itself around the individual, a rule that applied regardless of mood, benefit, or consequence, something that did not consult feeling before demanding obedience. This was a reversal, not an elevation. Freedom stopped asking what felt right. It began insisting on what would still hold if feeling disappeared. Actions chosen because they were required could be relied on in a way desire never could. Not because they were better, but because they did not drift. They did not change when conditions changed. They did not soften when pressure increased. This is where freedom began to feel heavier. Choice remained, but its character shifted. Responsibility no longer followed preference. It followed obligation. You were accountable not because you wanted an outcome, but because you were bound to a rule that did not belong to you alone. Freedom no longer widened possibility. It narrowed movement. This narrowing was deliberate. Kant believed that only a freedom anchored in something impersonal could persist. Anything rooted in inclination eventually fractured. What began as self-expression became reaction. What felt autonomous revealed itself as responsive to forces it did not control. A freedom rooted in emotion never stayed where it began. It moved with circumstance. It bent toward advantage. It followed pressure. Duty did not. Duty did not adjust itself. It did not negotiate. It did not explain itself. It held. This is what made Kant's account to freedom difficult to live inside. It did not promise fulfillment. It did not reward sincerity. It required alignment without reassurance. The warmth of moral feeling began to recede. Sympathy became unreliable. Intention mattered less than structure. You could feel strongly and still fail. You could mean well and still fall short. What governed you mattered more than what moved you. Kant did not frame this as sacrifice. He framed it as necessity. Without this shift, freedom would dissolve into responsiveness. It would mirror whatever force acted most strongly in a given moment. Over time, it would become indistinguishable from compliance. Freedom no longer felt light. It no longer felt expressive. It felt exacting. You were free, but not in motion. You were free, but held in place by something that did not care how it felt to carry it. This is where Kant's system became quietly exhausting. Not because it was harsh, but because it did not move out of the way. It asked you to act without warmth, to choose without relief, to accept that freedom might not feel like possibility at all. It might feel like weight. And once freedom takes this form, the question is no longer how wide your options are. It is how much weight freedom places on you. Once there is nowhere left to set it down. Once freedom was narrowed, morality could no longer remain familiar. For a long time, morality had been tied to feeling, sympathy, compassion, the sense that doing the right thing should feel right. Moral life was imagined as an extension of human warmth, guided by empathy and reinforced by approval. Kant did not trust this arrangement, not because feelings were wrong, but because they were uneven. They arrived at different times. They attached to different people. They intensified for some situations and vanished for others. A morality that depended on feeling could never apply evenly, and anything uneven could not claim authority. Kant believed morality had to function without relying on what humans happened to feel in a given moment. Otherwise, obligation would fluctuate with mood, proximity, and familiarity. What moved one person deeply might leave another untouched. What inspired care in one context might produce indifference in another. That kind of morality could not hold. So Kant removed comfort from it. Morality no longer asked what felt compassionate. It asked what could be required universally. This was not meant to improve behavior, it was meant to stabilize it. The moral demand no longer emerged from sympathy or shared feeling. It came from structure, from rules that did not adjust themselves based on who was involved or how the situation felt. This made morality colder. It also made it reliable. Actions were no longer judged by intention alone. Good feelings were no longer sufficient. What mattered was whether the action could be justified as binding, regardless of circumstance. You could care deeply and still act wrongly. You could feel nothing and still act correctly. This inversion unsettled many people. Morality stopped offering reassurance. It no longer aligned itself with emotional reward. Doing the right thing did not promise satisfaction. It did not guarantee recognition. It did not ensure a sense of inner harmony. It simply required compliance. Kant believed this was unavoidable. If morality was to survive as something more than preference, it had to detach itself from experience. It had to operate independently of how situations appeared to us, or how strongly they affected us. Otherwise, it would dissolve into sentiment, changing shape every time feeling shifted. This detachment changed how moral life felt. It became exacting, impersonal, difficult to internalize. You were no longer guided by what moved you. You were governed by what held, even when nothing in you responded to it. Moral action became something you submitted to rather than something you expressed. This did not make people cruel. It made morality indifferent to comfort. Kant did not deny that compassion mattered in human life. He denied that it could ground obligation. Sympathy could motivate action, but it could not justify it. Feeling could accompany morality, but it could not define it. This separation left the gap between what people felt was right and what morality required. Living inside that gap was exhausting. You could no longer rely on inner reassurance. Moral clarity no longer came with emotional alignment. Doing what was required might feel hollow, heavy, or even alienating. But Kant believed that anything less would collapse under pressure. A morality rooted in feeling could not survive conflict. It would bend toward those closest, loudest, or most familiar. Over time, it would justify partiality while pretending to be fair. Morality without comfort avoided that fate. By stripping moral obligation of warmth, Kant preserved its shape. It could apply everywhere, even where sympathy failed. It could demand consistency without asking to be liked. But this consistency carried a cost. Moral life became lonely. You could be correct and still feel wrong. You could act rightly and feel nothing. There was no guarantee of alignment between obligation and experience. Kant accepted this outcome. For him, morality was not meant to soothe. It was meant to bind. It existed to hold human action in place, even when nothing inside the individual wanted to be held. Once morality took this form, it no longer offered comfort. It offered structure. And structure, when stripped of reassurance, does not feel humane. It feels necessary. This is the moral world Kant leaves behind. A world where doing the right thing may cost you warmth, certainty, and relief, but where obligation endures precisely because it no longer depends on them. By the time Kant's system settles into place, something subtle has changed. Knowledge has been contained, science has been narrowed, freedom has been weighted, morality has been stripped of comfort. Each move was made to preserve stability. Together, they produce something else. Consistency. At first, consistency feels like relief. Rules apply evenly. Obligations do not shift with circumstance. Expectations become predictable. The chaos created by competing claims begins to quiet. Life acquires structure that does not depend on persuasion or feeling. Things hold, but consistency does not come without cost. Because once rules no longer bend, neither does the world they govern. Situations that once allowed discretion now demand alignment. Exceptions disappear. The space where judgment once softened, obligation begins to close. Kant accepted this. He believed that without consistency, everything else would fracture. Knowledge would collapse into argument. Morality would dissolve into preference. Freedom would drift into responsiveness. Consistency was the price of endurance. But endurance is not neutral. A system that holds everywhere also presses everywhere. What applies universally does not pause for context. It does not wait for circumstances to improve. It does not adapt itself to human fragility. It applies. This is where Kant's world begins to feel heavy, not because it is oppressive, but because it is exact. Once obligation is detached from feeling, it no longer arrives gently. It does not negotiate with circumstance. It does not consider exhaustion, fear, or regret. It remains the same regardless of who is carrying it. Consistency treats everyone equally. It also treats everyone impersonally. Kant believed this impersonality was necessary. Without it, rules would erode, obligations would soften. Over time, consistency would be replaced by convenience, and structure would give way to adjustment. But impersonality creates distance between the rule and the person, between obligation and experience, between what must be done and what can be endured. Living inside this distance requires endurance of a different kind. You are no longer asked to feel aligned. You are asked to remain consistent, even when the cost accumulates, even when the rule does not acknowledge strain. Consistency does not respond to difficulty. It does not offer relief for effort already given. It does not adjust itself because the burden has grown heavier. It simply continues. This persistence changes how responsibility feels. Responsibility stops being something taken on. It becomes something born, a condition rather than a choice. He did not suggest that consistency would feel humane once people adjusted to it. He accepted that something essential would be lost in exchange for stability, the ability to bend, the comfort of exception, the relief of being understood rather than measured. These losses were not accidents, they were the price. Kant believed that a system capable of holding under pressure could not be built around human variability. It had to be built around rules that did not change when people did. This ensured coherence. It also ensured tension. A life lived under consistency requires constant self-regulation. You must align yourself repeatedly with demands that do not acknowledge effort. You must continue acting as required even when nothing in the system reflects what it costs you to do so. Over time, this produces fatigue, not physical exhaustion, moral fatigue, the quiet strain of carrying obligations that do not loosen, the steady effort of maintaining alignment without reassurance, the sense that responsibility never completes itself, never resolves, never gives back. Kant did not see this fatigue as failure. He saw it as evidence that the system was working. A structure that demanded nothing would not hold. A morality that felt easy would not endure. A freedom that did not cost anything would dissolve into inclination. Consistency ensured survival. But survival has a texture. It is not warm. It is not affirming. It is persistent. The question is, what kind of human life remains possible inside something that works precisely because it does not respond? And once consistency becomes the highest value, there is no obvious place to put the weight it creates. It does not disappear. It accumulates, quietly, relentlessly. And the system does not notice, because noticing is not required for it to continue. By this point, something else has changed, not visibly, not in a way that interrupts anything. Life continues. Actions still follow one another. Rules still apply. Obligations are still carried out. Meaning no longer intervenes. For a long time, meaning had been involved. It accompanied action. It explained difficulty. It offered reasons that made demands feel connected to something larger. That involvement ends. Not because meaning disappears, but because nothing waits for it. Requirements arrive without explanation. Duties apply without asking whether they make sense. Action continues without being justified to the person performing it. People continue to ask why. Nothing responds. This does not stop the system. Schedules continue. Expectations hold. Responsibilities repeat. Meaning is no longer consulted. It becomes separate. People still think about it. They still search for it. They still return to it. In private moments. But it does not alter what happens. Understanding no longer changes outcome. Explanation no longer reduces demand. Purpose no longer modifies requirement. Things proceed. This separation is not dramatic. No belief collapses. No revelation occurs. Meaning is simply no longer operational. Kant accepted this. He believed that allowing meaning to explain obligation weakened obligation. Interpretation interfered. Personal justification softened consistency. Over time, requirement lost its shape, so meaning was removed from that role, not debated, not disproven, just excluded. Rules do not require explanation in order to apply. Obligation does not pause to be understood. Requirement does not adjust itself based on comprehension. It continues. This creates a particular condition, not despair, not confusion, flatness. Action follows action. Duty follows duty. The system advances without commentary. Nothing arrives to frame it. Nothing interrupts it to explain why it matters. People may still care. They may still hold beliefs. They may still construct reasons for themselves. They may still tell internal stories about purpose. But these do not intervene. Meaning accompanies action without influencing it. You can understand why something matters and still be required to do it, even if that understanding disappears. You can stop believing in the reason behind an obligation without losing the obligation itself. You can lose conviction. Nothing stops. Meaning does not slow requirement. It does not redirect it. It does not excuse it. It remains present, but inactive. Kant did not see this as failure. He saw it as order. Meaning had been doing work it could not reliably sustain. It shifted with interpretation. It varied with belief. It softened when pressure increased. By removing it from obligation, requirement could remain consistent even when understanding failed. But consistency does not explain itself. Action becomes repetitive. Responsibility continues without narrative. There is no longer a reason that completes the action. only the action. This does not eliminate belief. People still believe. They still reflect. They still search. But belief no longer governs what happens. Meaning becomes something held rather than something applied, something private rather than operative, something that exists without authority. The system continues without it. Obligation applies, rules hold, requirements repeat. Meaning does not intervene. It does not protect. It does not justify. It does not mediate. It remains alongside demand, unable to change it. Meaning remains, but stripped of effect. It does not stop anything. It does not alter outcomes. It does not relieve weight. The system remains intact. Obligation continues. Once meaning stops intervening, belief can no longer remain where it was. For a long time, belief leaned on knowledge. It borrowed steadiness from explanation. Even when certainty was incomplete, there was an assumption that reason pointed in the right direction. That belief rested on something stable, even if it could not yet be fully grasped. That assumption no longer holds. When knowledge is restricted to experience, anything beyond it loses its claim to certainty. Questions about God, the soul, ultimate purpose, or what lies behind the world are no longer answered by thinking. They are not postponed. They are not reframed. They are no longer addressed. Belief does not disappear. It is separated. Faith no longer inherits confidence from knowledge. It no longer leans on proof. It no longer draws authority from explanation. It cannot appeal to reason when challenged. It cannot claim universality. It continues without ground. This changes how belief behaves. Belief no longer stabilizes understanding. It no longer completes the structure of the world. It no longer closes uncertainty. It remains present, but it does not organize anything. People may still believe. They may still pray. They may still orient their lives around faith. But belief no longer governs what happens. It does not determine obligation. It does not justify action. It does not resolve contradiction. It exists alongside uncertainty rather than overcoming it. This is not a crisis. Nothing collapses. Life continues. Knowledge proceeds within its limits. Rules apply. Obligations repeat. Belief does not intervene. Kant accepted this condition. He believed that belief grounded in knowledge would not survive scrutiny. Once reason failed to secure proof, faith that depended on explanation would fall with it. By removing belief from the domain of knowledge, belief could persist without demanding certainty. But persistence is not reassurance. Belief now stands exposed. It cannot claim necessity. It cannot demand agreement. It cannot settle argument. It can only be held. Faith becomes something personal rather than structural, private rather than authoritative. It may guide an individual quietly, but it no longer governs systems. It no longer completes explanations. It no longer closes the world. Knowledge functions. Obligation holds. Consistency remains. Belief is present but unsupported. This produces tension that does not resolve. Belief still asks for commitment. It still requires allegiance. It does not promise coherence. It does not ensure that what is believed aligns with what is required. Nothing confirms it. Nothing refutes it. Belief persists without reinforcement. Kant did not attempt to resolve this tension. He accepted it. Belief in his structure is no longer something that explains reality. It does not ground morality. It does not secure meaning. It exists without authority and without proof. It is allowed, but it is not empowered. This reshapes religious life. Faith becomes quieter, less assertive, less secure. It can orient a life privately, but it cannot justify a system publicly. It can be held deeply, but it cannot demand that others accept it. It does not close questions. It endures them. Endurance replaces confidence. Belief becomes something you carry without reinforcement. It does not answer why obligation exists. It does not soften duty. It does not restore meaning where meaning has been displaced. It simply remains. People may still believe that belief matters. They may still hope it does. They may still act as if it does. But belief no longer alters what proceeds. The system does not wait for it. Obligation does not pause for it. Knowledge does not defer to it. Faith stands beside the world rather than explaining it. Kant's structure leaves belief intact, but it leaves it unsupported. Faith no longer rests on knowledge. It no longer borrows certainty. It rests on nothing beneath it. And once belief stands without ground, it no longer answers questions. It does not close gaps. It does not resolve uncertainty. It continues. By this point, something about the self has changed. Not its existence, not its responsibilities, its position. Earlier, the self had been assumed to stand close to what it did, to know why it acted, to recognize itself in its choices, to feel some continuity between intention, action, and outcome. That closeness no longer holds. Once knowledge is limited, freedom is weighted, morality is stripped of comfort, meaning is displaced, and belief stands without ground, the self loses something it quietly depended on. Access. The self still acts. It still chooses. It still bears responsibility, but it no longer stands inside the reasons that justify those actions. For a long time, people assumed that acting meant understanding, that choosing meant recognizing oneself in the choice. That responsibility implied a form of self-knowledge, even if imperfect. Kant did not preserve this assumption. He believed that the self, like knowledge, had been granted too much access. It was treated as if it could fully know its own motives, its own freedom, its own place in the order of things. This confidence had to be reduced. The self, Kant argued, does not fully know itself as it acts. It experiences its own decisions, but it does not have direct access to what grounds them. It cannot step outside its own structure to observe itself clearly. This was not meant to be unsettling. It was meant to be accurate. Once reason accepts limits, the self cannot claim transparency. It cannot fully grasp what it is beyond how it appears to itself. It cannot confirm whether it is truly free in the way it experiences freedom. It cannot secure knowledge of itself as an object. The self becomes something lived but not fully known. This changes responsibility. Responsibility no longer rests on self-understanding. It no longer depends on recognizing oneself clearly in one's actions. It does not require certainty about motive or outcome. Responsibility continues regardless. You are accountable not because you know yourself completely, but because obligation applies whether you do or not. The self is bound by rules it cannot fully explain to itself. This creates distance between who you feel yourself to be and what you are required to do, between intention and obligation, between experience and structure. Kant did not try to close this distance. He accepted it. He believed that requiring self-knowledge as a condition for responsibility would undermine responsibility itself. If obligation depended on full understanding, it would dissolve whenever understanding failed. So responsibility was detached from access. You act, you are accountable, whether or not you fully understand yourself. This makes the self quieter. It no longer stands at the center, explaining its own actions. It no longer guarantees coherence between inner life and outward demand. It exists within a structure it does not fully grasp. The self becomes something that operates under rules rather than something that authors them completely. This does not eliminate agency, it constrains it. You still decide, you still act, but you do so without full access to the grounds of your own decision-making. This is not ignorance, it is limitation. Kant believed that pretending otherwise was dangerous. A self that claims full transparency begins to justify itself too easily. It mistakes confidence for insight. It treats its own perspective as sufficient. Reducing access prevents this, but it also removes reassurance. You can no longer rely on self-knowledge to confirm that you are acting freely. You cannot verify your autonomy by introspection. You cannot settle doubt by looking inward. The self is no longer a source of certainty. It becomes a site of responsibility without explanation. This shifts how identity feels. Identity no longer comes from understanding who you are. It comes from what you are bound to do. Continuity is no longer guaranteed by narrative. It is maintained by obligation. The self persists not because it recognizes itself, but because it continues acting under the same demands. This endurance is impersonal. It does not respond to self-image. It does not confirm authenticity. It simply holds. Kant accepted that this would feel alienating. A self without access cannot fully affirm itself. It cannot locate itself comfortably within the system it inhabits. It carries responsibility without the relief of explanation. But Kant believed the alternative was worse. A self that claimed full access would overreach. It would justify itself too easily. It would mistake feeling for freedom and coherence for truth. Limiting the self-preserved responsibility. At a cost, the self becomes something you live as, rather than something you fully know. You act as a responsible agent without complete clarity about what that agency ultimately rests on. You continue without confirmation. This is the shape of the self that remains in Kant's system. Not expressive, not transparent, accountable. The self does not disappear. It endures. But it endures without access to the reasons that once made endurance feel coherent. And once the self is placed in this position, the question is no longer who you are. It is how long responsibility can be carried when it no longer answers back. By now, action has taken on a different character, not because rules have changed, but because what they offer has been removed. Earlier, obedience was often paired with reward, moral approval, inner reassurance, the sense that doing what was required would eventually return something in kind. Even when action was difficult, it carried the promise of resolution. That promise no longer applies. In Kant's structure, obedience is not rewarded with comfort. It is not followed by relief. It does not guarantee satisfaction, recognition, or peace. Action completes itself without offering anything back. Obedience continues without return. This does not feel heroic. It feels procedural. Rules apply. Duties repeat. Actions are carried out because they are required. Nothing arrives afterward to confirm that the effort mattered. Kant believed this was unavoidable. If obedience depended on reward, it would eventually collapse into calculation. People would act in anticipation of benefit rather than obligation. Duty would become conditional, shaped by what it promised rather than what it required. So reward was removed, not forbidden, just excluded from relevance. Obedience no longer waited for acknowledgement. It did not expect satisfaction. It did not seek alignment between effort and outcome. It proceeded. This changes how moral life feels. Doing what is required no longer produces a sense of completion. There is no internal signal that the action has resolved something. No moment where obligation loosens because it has been fulfilled. One action ends, another begins. The system does not mark progress. Kant did not frame this as sacrifice. He framed it as consistency. A morality that rewarded obedience would eventually be shaped by what felt good to receive. Over time, the promise of reward would replace obligation itself. Removing reward ensured that duty remained impersonal, unaffected by desire for outcome. But impersonality is not neutral. You continue without knowing whether the effort has any lasting effect. This creates a particular fatigue, not exhaustion from difficulty. Fatigue from repetition, the steady effort of aligning yourself with requirements that do not respond. The experience of doing what is demanded without any sense that the demand has noticed you doing it. Kant did not see this fatigue as a flaw. He saw it as a sign that obedience had been separated from inclination. That action was no longer motivated by desire for outcome, approval, or reward. But separation does not remove strain. It concentrates it. Obedience without reward strips action of narrative. There is no story of progress, no accumulation of merit, no sense that repeated effort leads somewhere recognizable. Responsibility becomes continuous. You do not finish it. You do not complete it. You carry it. This does not make obedience meaningless. It makes it indifferent to meaning. You may still believe that what you do matters. You may still hope that obligation serves a larger purpose. But the system does not confirm this. It does not respond to hope or belief. It requires action. And once action is required without reward, the reason for continuing can no longer come from outcome. It must come from alignment with obligation alone. Kant believed this was the only way moral action could remain free from calculation. If obedience depended on what followed it, it would cease to be obedience. But this freedom is austere. It offers no consolation. It provides no assurance. It does not comfort those who comply. Obedience becomes something that exists without recognition, something that continues even when it no longer feels justified by result. The self obeys not because obedience feels right, but because it is required. This is where Kant's moral world becomes stark, not because it demands cruelty, but because it removes consolation. You act, you comply, and nothing arrives to tell you that you have done enough. The system does not close, it does not soften, it does not reward. Obedience continues. And once reward is removed, the only question that remains is whether obligation can be sustained when nothing follows it except the next demand. Kant believed it could. He built a structure that assumes it must. What remains is a moral life without release, a pattern of action without resolution, a form of obedience that persists not because it satisfies, but because nothing in the system allows it to stop. At a certain point, obedience stops feeling like a decision, not because it is forced, but because nothing else presents itself as an alternative. After obligation has been separated from reward, after action continues without reassurance, something subtle happens. People stop asking whether they will comply. The question no longer arises. Compliance becomes assumed. Rules are followed because they are there. Duties are carried out because they continue. Action proceeds not because it is chosen each time, but because stopping would require an explanation the system does not ask for. Continuation replaces choice. This does not feel like coercion. There is no moment of refusal overcome, no pressure applied. Life simply moves forward along the paths already laid out. Kant understood this outcome. He did not imagine a world where people consciously obeyed at every step. He imagined a world where obligation became the background condition of action, where the question was no longer whether one should act, but how. Once obligation is stable enough, it no longer needs to justify itself. It does not announce its presence. It does not argue. It is encountered the way gravity is encountered. By continuing, people wake up inside it. They move through it. They respond to it without naming it. This does not eliminate freedom. It relocates it. Freedom no longer appears as a series of visible choices. It becomes embedded in compliance itself. Action still occurs, but the sense of choosing gives way to the sense of proceeding. You act because the situation calls for action. You comply because compliance is what happens next. This is not resignation. It is normalization. Over time, the effort required to question obligation begins to feel disproportionate. To pause, to reflect, to resist feels like interruption rather than deliberation. The system has no space marked for refusal, not because refusal is forbidden, but because it no longer fits. Kant did not believe this was a flaw. He believed that a structure dependent on constant decision would eventually collapse. Fatigue would set in, inconsistency would spread, obligation would erode. Continuation prevented that. By allowing action to proceed without repeated choice, the system could endure. Responsibility could remain intact even when attention wandered. Compliance could persist even when conviction weakened. This endurance changes how life is experienced. You may still feel moments of resistance. You may still question privately. You may still wonder whether things could be otherwise, but these moments do not interrupt the flow. The system does not pause for them. Action resumes. This produces a particular quiet, not peace, not calm, a settling. Life becomes something you move through rather than decide anew each day. Responsibility becomes habitual. Obligation becomes environmental. You are inside it. A world where obligation proceeds automatically can hold, but holding has a consequence. When continuation replaces choice, responsibility loses its edge. It no longer feels like something taken on. It becomes something already in place. The weight is still there, but it is no longer lifted consciously. It is carried by default. This does not make responsibility lighter. It makes it less visible. People still act. They still comply. They still bear consequences. But the sense of deciding fades. Action becomes routine. Obligation becomes expected. Compliance becomes part of how things are done, rather than something that requires justification. Kant did not see this as dehumanizing. He saw it as realistic. A system that required constant reaffirmation would not survive. A moral life that depended on renewed conviction would fracture. Continuation was the only way obligation could persist across time, fatigue, doubt, and disagreement. So choice recedes, not eliminated, but overshadowed. What remains is movement, forward, again, and again. This is the moment where Kant's structure becomes difficult to notice, not because it disappears, but because it blends into life itself. And once continuation replaces choice, the unsettling question is no longer whether you agree with the system. It is whether you can tell where it ends and where you begin. By this point, Kant is no longer something you study. He is something you inhabit. Not consciously, not deliberately. The system does not announce itself. It does not ask for agreement. It does not require belief. It simply continues, shaping how things are expected to work. Knowledge remains contained. Science proceeds within limits. Freedom carries weight. Morality applies without comfort. Meaning no longer intervenes. Obedience continues without reward. Nothing here feels dramatic. That is the point. Kant's achievement was not to persuade people to adopt a worldview. It was to build a structure that could function without persuasion. A way of organizing life that did not depend on shared feeling, common belief, or emotional alignment. It holds even when people disagree about everything else. Modern life rests inside this. We expect systems to function regardless of belief. We trust procedures more than intentions. We rely on rules that apply evenly rather than judgments that adapt. We accept that obligation does not need to feel meaningful in order to be binding. These expectations feel normal. They are not. They are the result of a decision to prioritize stability over excess, to allow structures to continue without explanation, to accept that understanding is not required for participation. You do not need to agree with a system to be governed by it. You do not need to believe in a rule for it to apply. You do not need to find meaning in obligation for it to continue. This is Kant's world. A world where coherence is maintained without reassurance, where consistency matters more than interpretation, where responsibility persists even when the reasons behind it feel distant or unclear. Living inside this structure produces a particular experience. Life becomes functional before it becomes intelligible. Processes matter more than narratives. Reliability is valued over depth. Systems are trusted not because they explain, but because they endure. This endurance comes at a cost. You may find yourself doing what is required without knowing why it still matters. You may act correctly without feeling aligned. You may comply without recognition. None of this interrupts the system. It continues. Kant did not design this world to be satisfying. He designed it to hold. A structure that depended on meaning would fracture when meaning failed. A morality that required feeling would collapse under strain. A freedom that needed reassurance would dissolve into responsiveness. What remains is something quieter, a world that works. But working is not the same as feeling whole. People living inside Kant's structure often sense a gap they cannot quite name, the sense that life functions smoothly while something essential remains out of reach. That obligation is everywhere, but explanation is scarce. That responsibility is constant, but resolution is rare. This is not an error. It is the condition. Kant believed that trying to close this gap would undo the structure, that reintroducing comfort, meaning, or access at the foundation would eventually weaken what held everything together. So the gap remains, and people learn to live with it. They build identities around roles rather than understanding. They measure success through compliance and consistency rather than fulfillment. They rely on systems to carry weight that individuals no longer can. This does not eliminate human longing. It reorganizes it. Longing becomes private. Belief becomes personal. Meaning becomes optional. None of these disrupt what must be done. Kant's structure does not ask whether this feels right. It asks whether it continues, and it does, across institutions, across generations, across lives that never study Kant and never need to. His philosophy does not require recognition to operate. It does not depend on loyalty. It does not announce itself in daily life. It simply sets the conditions. Conditions where explanation is no longer necessary for action, where obligation does not wait for belief, where systems are trusted more than selves, where consistency outlasts conviction. Living inside this structure is not a choice, it is a fact. You can resist it emotionally. You can reject it intellectually. You can search for meaning elsewhere. The structure does not respond. It continues. A way of organizing reality that assumes stability is worth the cost of distance, that accepts the loss of warmth, access, and reassurance as the price of endurance. Whether that price is too high is not a question the structure answers. It does not evaluate itself. It simply remains. And once you recognize that you are already living inside it, the unsettling part is not that Kant was right or wrong. It is that leaving the structure would require giving up the very things that allow life, as it currently functions, to continue at all. At this stage, it becomes possible to see the full cost, not as a list, not as a theory, as absence. Kant's structure holds, that much is clear. It stabilizes knowledge. It preserves science. It maintains obligation. It allows systems to function without belief, without meaning, without reassurance. But holding requires subtraction. What was given up did not vanish all at once. It was not declared unnecessary. It was not rejected openly. It was gradually made irrelevant to how things proceed. Warmth was one of the first losses. Not kindness, not care, but the expectation that warmth should matter to obligation. That doing what is required would feel aligned, affirmed, or understood. In Kant's structure, warmth becomes incidental, present, perhaps, but no longer decisive. Access followed. The belief that the mind could reach reality directly, that the self could know itself fully, that understanding could ground responsibility. These assumptions were not disproven. They were set aside. Explanation went next. Not explanation as information, but explanation as justification. The idea that knowing why something mattered could soften what it demanded. That meaning could mediate between burden and acceptance. That role was removed. Faith lost its footing. Not belief itself, but belief as something that could stabilize the world. Faith continued, without ground, without authority, without the power to intervene. It survived, but as something carried privately rather than relied on structurally. Reward disappeared, not outcomes, not consequences, but the expectation that obedience would return something to the one who complied. That effort would be acknowledged. That responsibility would complete itself. It did not. The sense that you could fully recognize yourself in your actions, that introspection could confirm autonomy, that knowing yourself would secure freedom. The self remained, access did not. Each of these losses was small on its own. Together, they changed the texture of life. Life became reliable before it became meaningful, stable before it became comprehensible, functional before it felt humane. Systems could be trusted even when individuals could not explain why they continued to comply with them. This trade was not accidental. Kant believed that anything preserved by comfort would eventually collapse under pressure, that anything grounded in feeling would fracture, that anything requiring reassurance would fail when reassurance was unavailable. So what could not endure was removed. What remained was enough. Enough for science to work. Enough for morality to apply. Enough for freedom to persist as obligation. Enough for systems to continue. But enough is not the same as whole. Something essential was no longer addressed, not because it was unimportant, but because addressing it weakened the structure. Kant did not deny this, he accepted it. The cost was not hidden, it was absorbed, distributed across daily life in ways that rarely announced themselves. People adjusted. They learned to live inside systems that did not respond, to act without reassurance, to comply without recognition. Over time, this adjustment became normal. Distance felt ordinary. Procedure felt natural. Consistency felt responsible. The losses became difficult to name because nothing obvious replaced them. There was no alternative structure waiting in reserve. What was given up could not be recovered without undoing what had been built. This is why Kant's system is so difficult to leave, not because it convinces, but because it works. Leaving it would mean reintroducing uncertainty where stability now exists, allowing feeling to matter where rules now hold, letting meaning intervene where obligation now proceeds uninterrupted. It would mean accepting fragility again. Kant decided that fragility was too high a price, so something else had to be paid. And that payment continues, not as a single loss, but as a background condition, a world that functions without asking whether it feels complete, a moral life that persists without consolation, a sense of responsibility that does not answer back. This is what had to be given up, not all at once, but permanently. And once it is gone, there is no clear way to retrieve it without losing the structure that made modern life possible in the first place. By the end of this structure, nothing dramatic happens. There is no collapse, no revelation, no final correction. Everything continues. That is the point. Kant did not design a system meant to culminate in insight. He designed one meant to endure, something that could survive disagreement, fatigue, loss of meaning, and the absence of belief, without needing to be repaired each time any of those occurred. It is inheritance, not ideas passed down consciously, but conditions absorbed quietly, expectations about how life should function, assumptions about what can be trusted, habits of action that no longer require justification. The structure outlives the thinker. People born into it do not encounter it as philosophy. They encounter it as normality, as procedure, as the way things are done when explanation is unavailable and feeling cannot be relied upon. They do not ask why systems continue. They expect them to. This expectation shapes everything that follows. Institutions are built to function without shared belief. Rules are designed to apply regardless of interpretation. Responsibility is assigned without requiring alignment or understanding. Obedience is assumed to persist even when reward disappears. These are not ideological choices. They are structural inheritances. Kant's world does not need defenders. It does not require loyalty. It does not ask to be remembered. It continues because it solved a problem that never fully went away: how to make things hold when nothing agrees. It is a world that trusts systems more than selves, because selves are variable and systems endure. This preference does not announce itself as loss. It announces itself as practicality. Things work. Processes repeat. Outcomes remain predictable. Life feels manageable. But manageability is not the same as fulfillment. Over time, people begin to notice something without quite naming it. A sense that life functions smoothly while something essential remains untouched. That obligation is everywhere, but explanation is scarce. That responsibility is constant, but resolution is rare. These sensations do not disrupt the structure. They coexist with it. People adapt. They build meaning privately rather than structurally. They place belief outside systems rather than inside them. They seek warmth in relationships rather than institutions. They look for fulfillment in spaces that do not threaten consistency. This adaptation is not resistance, it is accommodation. Kant's structure allows this. It does not interfere with private meaning as long as private meaning does not interfere with obligation. It tolerates belief as long as belief does not claim authority. It allows longing. As longing does not interrupt procedure, the system is indifferent, and indifference is stable. What continues after Kant is not agreement with his conclusions. It is dependence on the conditions he established, a reliance on frameworks that function without explanation, a trust in processes that do not need to feel right in order to apply. Leaving this structure would require more than disagreement. It would require vulnerability. It would mean allowing meaning to intervene again, letting feeling influence obligation, accepting that systems might fracture under pressure, tolerating inconsistency in exchange for warmth, access, or reassurance. Kant judged that exchange too risky. So, the structure remains. It absorbs criticism. It survives reform. It incorporates dissent without changing its foundation. People argue about values, beliefs, and identities while continuing to operate inside the same procedural frame. The disagreements feel intense. The structure remains untouched. This is Kant's quiet legacy, not clarity, continuation. A world that does not need to explain itself in order to persist. A moral life that does not offer consolation. A form of freedom that carries weight without promise. A sense of responsibility that does not answer back. What continues after Kant is not his philosophy. It is the expectation that life should work, even when it does not feel meaningful. That consistency is preferable to collapse. These expectations now feel ordinary. They are not. They are the result of a decision to accept distance as the price of endurance. Kant did not ask whether this world would feel humane. He asked whether it would hold. It does. And as long as holding remains the highest priority, what comes after Kant will continue to look very much like what he left behind. Not because anyone chose it, but because once a structure proves that it can survive without reassurance, it becomes difficult to imagine living without it. The end of this story, nothing resolves. There is no final insight that restores what was lost. No synthesis that reunites meaning with obligation. No return to warmth that does not threaten a structure. What remains is continuation. This is easy to mistake for emptiness. It is not. It is a condition. Kant did not remove meaning because it was false. He removed it because it could not be trusted to hold. He did not strip comfort because it was undesirable. He stripped it because it weakened what needed to endure. What he left behind was not a vision of the good life. It was a way to keep life from collapsing. That distinction matters. Most philosophies promise direction. Kant offered containment. Most systems offer answers. His offered limits. Most moral frameworks try to persuade. This one does not. It applies. Living inside this structure does not feel dramatic. It feels ordinary. Procedures replace persuasion. Responsibility replaces reassurance. Obligation replaces explanation. Nothing announces that something has gone missing. People still work. They still care. They still believe. But these no longer determine how the world functions. This is not because people stopped needing meaning. It is because meaning was removed from the machinery that makes things continue. The unsettling part is not that Kant was severe. It is that his severity worked. A world organized around consistency does not need consensus. A morality detached from feeling does not fracture when feeling fades. A system that does not require explanation does not fail when understanding falters. You feel it in the quiet moments, in the sense that effort does not accumulate, in the fatigue that comes from doing what is required without knowing when it will be enough. But the structure does not register this. It was not designed to. Kant did not intend to produce fulfillment. He intended to prevent collapse. He did not try to make life feel whole. He tried to make it hold. And it does. That is why his influence persists even where his name does not. Why his ideas shape lives that never encounter them. Why his structure feels unavoidable rather than imposed. It does not ask to be chosen. It assumes continuation. The most difficult realization is not that Kant changed how we think. It is that he changed what thinking is allowed to do. He placed borders around reason, weight on freedom, coldness in morality, distance between meaning and obligation. And then he let life proceed. There is no obvious way back from this. Any attempt to restore what was given up threatens the stability that now supports everything else. Any effort to let feeling intervene risks inconsistency. Any move to let meaning govern obligation risks fracture. This does not mean Kant was right. It means his solution solved the problem it was designed to solve. Whether it solved the right problem is a different question. 1. The structure does not ask. 1. It does not answer. And perhaps that is the final inheritance. A world that continues without asking whether it should feel different. A moral life that persists without consolation. A form of freedom that carries weight without promise. A life that works. And once life works well enough, the pressure to ask what was lost becomes quieter, not because the loss disappears, but because nothing in the system requires it to be addressed. This is not the end of Kant's story. It is the point at which his story stops needing to be told, because it is already being lived.